Hi, my name is Emery Hastings. I'm 30 years old. And this is my story. You know that moment when you realize you've spent your whole life trying to impress people who never truly saw you? That's where everything began. I was standing in the middle of my apartment, staring at the invitation in my hand, a glossy, gold-trimmed card for my father's 60th birthday party. Except the envelope didn't have my name on it. It had my sister Claire's name. I was holding her mail by accident. Mine never arrived. That's when I knew something was wrong. Growing up in Lincoln, Nebraska, our house was the kind you pass on the highway and wonder what kind of people live there. White stone driveway, trimmed hedges, long porch with antique lanterns. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But inside, I was invisible. My father, Marshall Hastings, owned one of the largest agricultural machinery companies in the Midwest, Hastings Farm Tech. He built it from the ground up, and he never let anyone forget it, especially me. I was the middle child, the creative one, as my mom used to say, until she left. Claire, my older sister, followed in Dad's footsteps like she was born to. Business school, clean blazers, the family pride. And Ethan, our youngest brother, was the golden boy. Star athlete, always smiling, always praised. And then there was me. I chose art. I went into design. I opened a small branding agency downtown. Not a startup, not a tech unicorn, just a business I loved. That wasn't enough for my father, and I could live with that until the day I was shut out of the family for looking poor. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you're feeling the power in this story. You won't want to miss what comes next. You see, I'd been struggling the past few years. Clients come and go, pandemics hit, markets shift. There were months I barely made rent. I learned to make instant noodles gourmet, but I never stopped working. I refused to ask for help. I kept my pride, even when my credit card didn't. The week before Dad's birthday, Claire came by to drop off some documents. She left a stack of envelopes on my counter, and while sorting through them, I saw hers. An invitation to a black tie gala at the Lincoln Country Club. It was for close family, friends, and business partners. There were photos printed inside. A whole section called Legacy and Future. Ethan was on the cover, shaking hands with a new investor. Claire was in the middle, giving a speech. I wasn't in any of them. Not one. I texted her. Was I supposed to get one of these too? She replied 10 minutes later. It's more of a business celebration. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. That phrase sat on my chest like a weight I couldn't move. I stared at it for hours. It wasn't just a party. It was a message. I wasn't part of the family's image. I didn't belong in their version of success. But the final blow didn't come until 2 days later. I showed up anyway. I wasn't planning to go. But something inside me snapped. I took the old black dress I wore to gallery openings, paired it with a coat from Goodwill, tied my hair back, and walked through the doors of the country club like I had every right to be there. Because I did. The moment I stepped inside, I could feel it. The air was different. Polished. Cold. People in tailored suits laughed quietly behind champagne glasses. Waiters moved like shadows. The room was a picture-perfect celebration of wealth and status. And there I was, out of place, underdressed, underestimated. It didn't take long. One of my father's assistants approached me near the bar. She looked me up and down and said with a practiced smile, "I'm sorry, ma'am. This event is for family and business partners only." I stared at her, blinking. "I am family." She hesitated, leaned in and whispered, "Mr. Hastings asked that we not admit guests who don't meet the formal dress code. I'm really sorry." My heart didn't break. It froze. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just walked out. But something in me shifted that night. Not because I was excluded. I was used to that. But because I realized they thought I had nothing to offer. That I was just some poor, artsy middle child who would never be more than a blurry extra in their perfect family photo. They had no idea who I was becoming. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had spent the last year building something new, in silence, in shadows. I had partnered with a tech investor I met by chance at a design conference. He saw potential in my branding skills, and we co-founded a firm that specialized in complete visual strategy for agriculture startups, the very industry my father ruled over. Except we weren't selling tractors. We were selling identity. And in this world, identity was everything. We signed our first big client 6 months ago, then another, then another. Suddenly, the agency that wasn't enough for my father was consulting with some of the same firms that partnered with Hastings Farm Tech. I never flaunted it. I wasn't on magazine covers. I wasn't giving speeches in glass towers. But I was winning, quietly, strategically, patiently. And now, I had a plan. I didn't want revenge just to feel better. I wanted it to be poetic. I wanted them to remember the moment they told me I didn't belong, when I walked into that party and they saw me as poor. Because the next time I'd show up, I wouldn't need an invitation. That night, I went home and wrote down a single line in my journal. They dismissed me because I looked like nothing. I'll return when I look like power. And I meant it. You don't forget the moment your own blood treats you like a stranger. You don't forget the heat behind your eyes when you walk away without a scene. You don't forget the promise you make to yourself when the world turns its back. I was no longer Emery, the overlooked middle child. I was becoming Emery Hastings, the woman who would outgrow the house that tried to shrink her. Not with anger, but with precision. This is the story of how I turned humiliation into strategy, of how I transformed shame into leverage, of how I walked back into their world not as a guest, but as the boss. And trust me, they never saw it coming. The weeks following the party were filled with a different kind of silence than I was used to. It wasn't the silence of exclusion anymore. It was the silence before a storm. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw not just the girl who'd been turned away at the door, but the woman who was planning her return. I still lived in the same modest apartment in Lincoln, still walked to the office in shoes with scuffed soles, but something had changed behind my eyes. There was focus, fire. I was building something no one could take from me. My agency, Redfield Studio, was beginning to pick up momentum. We weren't big yet, not by my father's standards, but we had clients, real ones, and they were growing fast. Agritech startups that needed identity, voice, market presence. My co-founder, Miles, was brilliant with data and connections. I handled the face, the story, the presentation. Together, we created brands that didn't just look good, they demanded attention. And in a conservative industry like agriculture, that kind of edge was rare. But the game really began when one of our clients, Green Core Systems, secured a massive round of funding from a group of investors that included, coincidentally, one of my father's oldest business allies. I didn't know it at first. It wasn't until we were sitting in a conference room finalizing their new launch strategy that the client casually mentioned, "Marshall Hastings vouched for us with the board, said the brand looked polished enough to trust." I nearly dropped my pen. He didn't know. My father had seen the campaign we created, the pitch deck, the visuals, the story. He had vouched for it because it reminded him of excellence, and had no idea it came from the daughter he shut out. I didn't say a word, not then, because the beauty of revenge isn't in making a scene, it's in watching the truth unfold slowly, precisely, and I wanted every second of it. A few days later, I was invited to a private networking dinner in Omaha hosted by industry leaders. I hadn't planned to go. I was tired, overworked, still carrying the sting of rejection. But when I saw that Hastings Farm Tech was on the guest list, I knew I had to show up. I wore the same dress they told me wasn't good enough, but this time I added a coat that cost more than 3 months' rent, courtesy of our first big commission check. My hair was done professionally, makeup soft but sharp. I looked like power, because I was power. When I walked into the room, heads turned. Not because I was loud, not because I announced myself, but because there's something magnetic about walking like you have nothing to prove. I didn't search for familiar faces. I let them find me, and they did. Ethan was the first. He stood at the bar, sipping something amber-colored, wearing his signature navy suit. When his eyes caught mine, they widened in that slow, confused way you see in movies. He approached with hesitation. "Emery?" he asked, half laughing like it couldn't possibly be me. "Hi, Ethan," I said smoothly. "Didn't expect to see family here." He looked stunned for a moment, then recovered with a smile. "Didn't know you were in this circle." "I didn't know you were still pretending to be in charge of things you don't understand," I replied. It wasn't meant to cut, but it landed. Before he could respond, one of the hosts called for seating, and just like that, I was whisked away to a table near the front, right beside the man who once told my father that Hastings Farm Tech needed a rebrand to stay relevant. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dinner was a blur of laughter, clinking glasses, polite conversations. But the real highlight came when a small panel took place after dessert. A discussion about the future of agricultural technology and brand innovation. I was one of the panelists. As I stood on that small stage under warm lighting, I could see my father's face in the crowd. He was seated in the back next to Claire. His expression was unreadable. Not angry, not surprised. Just still, like he was watching a ghost. I spoke calmly, confidently, weaving stories about consumer trust, legacy branding, emotional connection. I used examples from Greencore and a few other clients. I never once mentioned my agency by name, but I saw the recognition in his eyes. He knew. Somewhere between the second and third case study, he realized who had built those campaigns. And that realization didn't just crack his composure, it shattered it. The applause was generous. After the panel, people came up to shake my hand, exchange cards, ask for consultations. I smiled, grateful, but inside I was trembling, not from nerves, from release. Years of being dismissed, overlooked, diminished, and now I was standing in the space they had tried to keep from me, not as a guest, not as a child, but as a peer. Later that night, Claire approached me in the parking lot. Her tone was clipped. "You blindsided him." "I showed up," I corrected. "Something I wasn't allowed to do at the party, remember?" She sighed, folding her arms. "He didn't know. He thought you weren't doing well. And you? You knew." She hesitated. "I didn't think you'd want to be part of it. You always hated that world." "I hated being excluded from it without a voice," I replied. Big difference. Claire didn't apologize. I didn't expect her to, but she looked at me with something new in her eyes. Not pity, not judgment, but maybe respect or fear, maybe both. Over the next few weeks, the phone calls began. Industry friends asking for collaborations. Clients who had once ghosted me suddenly wanting meetings. And then, one morning, an email came from Hastings Farm Tech, from my father's executive assistant. The subject line was simple: brand strategy consultation. I opened it 3 times before believing it was real. He wanted to schedule a meeting with Redfield. No mention of family, no personal note, just a request for professional services. I didn't reply immediately. I needed time, not to decide if I'd say yes, but how. Because now, I held the power. And this wasn't just about showing I could win. This was about making sure they never forgot who they tried to erase. I didn't sleep the night I received that email. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the screen of my phone still lit beside me like a burning reminder. Hastings Farm Tech was asking me for help. My father, Marshall Hastings, wanted to pay for the expertise he never thought I had. There was something poetic about it, almost too perfect. But poetry was never enough for me. I needed impact. I needed weight. And this moment carried both. The following morning, I responded with a single sentence. "We're available for a preliminary consultation on Thursday at 3 p.m. at our downtown office." No signature, no warmth, just business. That was the only language they ever seemed to understand. Thursday came faster than I expected. I wore a tailored emerald green suit, sharp, clean lines, the kind of outfit that said I knew exactly what I was doing. Miles set up the boardroom meticulously. Water bottles at each seat, our portfolio displayed on a mounted screen, soft lighting casting a golden hue across the conference table. Everything looked and felt polished, intentional, powerful, just the way I needed it to be. At exactly 3 o'clock, the elevator chimed and opened. My father stepped out, flanked by Claire and one of his legal advisors. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just smaller. Not physically, Marshall Hastings had always been an imposing figure, but emotionally. There was a tightness around his mouth, a hesitancy in his eyes that I had never seen before. "Mr. Hastings," I said, rising to greet him with a handshake. He blinked, surprised. "Emery." You're here for a consultation, I continued evenly. Let's keep it professional. He nodded, eyes flicking toward Claire as if unsure whether to speak. She avoided my gaze entirely. We sat. Miles began with the formal overview, explaining how Redfield approached identity revamps for legacy firms struggling to maintain market relevance in a shifting economic landscape. My father listened, arms crossed, saying nothing. Claire took notes. The advisor scrolled through something on his tablet. Then it was my turn. We've analyzed Hastings Farmtech's brand architecture, I began, clicking to the next slide. And while your historical presence in the agriculture sector remains solid, there's been a marked drop in trust engagement among younger stakeholders, particularly Gen Z and late millennials. Your messaging speaks to longevity, not innovation. That disconnect is growing. My voice was steady, unshaken. I had rehearsed every word, but when I looked directly at him and said, "Your brand is living off its reputation, not its vision," something shifted in the room. My father exhaled sharply, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement. He knew I was right. Claire spoke for the first time. What do you recommend? A complete rebuild, not of your product line, but of your identity. Your digital presence needs to reflect purpose, not just profit. Farmers today are technologists, environmentalists, entrepreneurs. If you don't reflect their values, you lose them. I flipped to a mock-up we had designed for the presentation, a modern, streamlined version of the Hastings logo, cleaner typography, a palette that evoked trust and growth. The tagline underneath read, "Rooted in legacy, rising for tomorrow." No one spoke for a moment. Then my father cleared his throat. Who wrote that line? I met his eyes. I did. He stared at me like he didn't quite know what to say. In truth, I don't think he did. I had rendered him speechless, something I'd only dreamed about growing up. The meeting ended with polite nods and firm handshakes. He didn't thank me, but he didn't dismiss me either. That, in itself, felt like a shift in the earth beneath my feet. 3 days later, we signed a 6-month contract. Redfield Studio would rebrand Hastings Farmtech. I wish I could say it felt like a triumph. In some ways, it did. But it also stirred something deeper. Grief, maybe. Not the kind that comes from loss, but the kind that comes from recognition. All those years I spent trying to be seen, to be enough, and all it took was power for them to finally look. In the weeks that followed, I worked with Claire closely. She was cold at first, mechanical, refusing to speak of anything that wasn't deliverable related. But gradually, the frost melted. One afternoon, during a content review, she looked up and said, "I didn't know you were this good." I raised an eyebrow. "Because no one ever asked." She looked down, tracing a line on the mock-up with her pen. "Dad was never going to see you unless you forced him to." "I know," I said. "That's why I stopped waiting." Claire was quiet after that, but her tone changed. She no longer spoke down to me. She no longer questioned every choice. She began to trust my vision, maybe even admire it. Then came the turning point, the one I hadn't planned for. It was a Thursday afternoon when Miles burst into my office, eyes wide. "You need to see this." He handed me his tablet. There was a press release, an official announcement on Hastings Farmtech's corporate website. The headline read, "Hastings Farmtech appoints new vice president of brand strategy, Emery Hastings." I blinked, scrolled down, my photo, my bio, a quote from my father calling me a bold leader shaping the future of agriculture's voice. I hadn't approved this. No one had asked. I was furious. I felt blindsided. I called Claire. "You posted this without my permission." "I didn't know," she said quickly. "Dad handled it. He said it was part of building momentum. He's using my name, my work. He wants credit for bringing me back in." "Isn't that what you wanted?" she asked. "To be recognized?" "Not as his puppet." That night, I went home and poured myself a glass of wine, sat in silence, the glow of the tablet still lingering in my mind. Part of me was angry, but another part, a quieter part, was starting to understand something else. Maybe this was my moment, not because he gave it to me, but because I had earned it so fully, so undeniably, that even he had to hold it up and say, "Look what she's done." But that wasn't enough for me. Not yet. Recognition was just the beginning. I wanted transformation, and I wanted the world to know exactly who had done it. The next morning, I walked into my office at Redfield earlier than usual. The air was still crisp, and the city of Lincoln hadn't yet found its rhythm. It was one of those mornings that felt suspended in time, silent, weighty, full of choices. I sat at my desk, the press release still open on my screen, my name under his logo, my story told in his voice. I didn't hate the words, but I hated how they got there. I could have let it slide. I could have said nothing, ridden the wave of sudden corporate fame and played the role of obedient daughter re-welcomed into the fold. But the truth was, I had grown too much to play a part that small again. At 9:30 sharp, I called for a team meeting. Miles looked at me as if he already knew. I stood before the whiteboard, marker in hand, and took a deep breath. "We are rewriting the terms of this deal," I said. "From this point forward, all public statements involving our agency, or me specifically, go through our internal review team. No more surprises, no more photo ops I didn't agree to. Hastings Farm Tech may be a client, but they are not our narrative." Miles grinned. "Finally," I nodded. "Also, I want to speak at the product launch, on stage. I want them to see that this campaign isn't just a fresh coat of paint. It's my vision, from beginning to end." We all agreed. We drafted a contract addendum, sent it over to Hastings Farm Tech, and I waited. The reply came in the form of a voicemail from my father. His voice was calm, but clipped. "Emery, I got your note. I don't think the launch event is the place for personal branding. Let's keep the focus on the company. Call me back." I didn't. Instead, I sent a formal letter, declining further work until the terms were renegotiated. It was risky, but I'd learned something in those years of being underestimated. Nothing gives you leverage like the willingness to walk away, even from your own family, especially from them. The next few days were quiet. Claire didn't reach out. My father remained silent. I braced myself for the fallout. Contracts canceled, reputation bruised. But the opposite happened. Word spread that Redfield had paused work with one of the most dominant agri-corporations in the region. Instead of scaring people off, it attracted them. I began receiving calls from firms that respected what I'd done, leaders who wanted that same courage on their side. People started seeing me not just as a designer or strategist, but as someone who held the power to say no. That shift, subtle, unspoken, was everything. Weeks passed. My father eventually signed the addendum. No comment, no call, just a signature. And when the day of the product launch came, I walked into the Lincoln Convention Center in heels that echoed across the marble floor like war drums. I had earned my space, and I intended to fill it completely. The stage was massive. Lights beamed down like halos. The audience included investors, media, clients, hundreds of eyes waiting for something polished and predictable. Instead, they got me. I stood at the center of the stage and opened with a story. "When I was 13, I said, I visited a farm outside of Hastings with my dad. I remember standing between rows of soybeans, staring at the horizon and hearing him say, 'The land teaches you patience, but branding teaches you presence.' I didn't understand it then, but I do now." I paused. The room held its breath. Hastings Farm Tech is no longer just a company rooted in the past. It's a brand speaking to the future. And this transformation wasn't born from reactivity. It came from intentional reinvention. Because in today's world, it's not enough to build legacy. You have to make it resonate. I clicked through slides that showed before and after snapshots, customer testimonials, and digital impressions that proved what data couldn't deny. I spoke like someone who belonged on that stage, not because of my last name, but because of the work I'd done. The silence that followed was heavy, but then, applause. Real, thunderous applause. After the event, reporters approached. Investors reached out. Clients requested meetings. But the most surprising moment came later, in a quiet hallway near the back of the building. My father stood there, alone, leaning against the wall like a man who had watched something slip just out of reach. "You did well," he said simply. "Thanks. I wasn't expecting that much fire." I raised an eyebrow. "You should have." He nodded slowly. "You remind me of your mother." That caught me off guard. He rarely mentioned her. After she left, we'd all learned to live like she was a myth, not a memory. I searched his face for more, but he offered nothing else. We stood there in silence. Not comfortable, not hostile, just two people who had finally seen each other clearly for the first time. He didn't apologize. I didn't ask him to, but I didn't need his regret anymore. I had outgrown the space where that kind of closure lived. That night, I went home to my apartment. Not the mansion I was raised in, not a penthouse downtown, just my small, bright place with its creaky floors and stubborn windows. And I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace. Because I had learned something far more valuable than revenge. I had learned the strength of claiming your space, of no longer shrinking to fit someone else's version of you, of refusing to let their silence define your worth. Claire called the next morning. She wanted to grab coffee. Just as sisters, she said. No business talk. I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe off O Street, and for the first time in years, we talked like equals. She told me how exhausting it was to always play the favorite, how she envied my freedom, my creativity, my grit. I told her I envied her structure, her certainty, her access. We both laughed at how wrong we'd been about each other. At one point, she looked at me seriously. You changed everything. No, I said, stirring my coffee. I finally stopped asking for permission. That became my motto in the months that followed. Redfield doubled in size. We opened a second location in Denver. Our work was featured in 3 major industry magazines. I was invited to speak at conferences, mentor young women in business, and collaborate with visionaries I had once admired from afar. And though I rarely saw my father after that, I heard from him more often. Emails, notes, questions about market trends or branding tips. He never said he was proud, but I saw it in the way he copied my words, the way he quoted me in meetings, the way Hastings Farm Tech continued to grow, not because he opened doors for me, but because I built a key to unlock my own. That was the real victory. And it tasted nothing like revenge. It tasted like freedom. The phone call that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of reviewing a campaign brief when Miles walked in, holding his phone out to me like it was radioactive. It's your father's assistant. She says it's urgent. I paused. It wasn't like them to call the office line. My father preferred everything to go through email. Professional, filtered, safe. So a direct call meant something had slipped beyond his control. I took the phone. Emery Hastings speaking. Miss Hastings, I'm sorry for the sudden contact, the voice said, formal and tight. But there's a situation you should be aware of. We've had a data breach. Someone leaked internal documents from the rebranding process, including strategy decks, presentation notes, and contract clauses. I stood up. How bad is it? Bad enough. The documents have already been shared with a competitor. They've mirrored several of the campaign pillars and are pushing out a near-identical launch in 2 weeks. My heart dropped. I knew immediately which competitor she meant. Beckman Agritech, an old rival of my father's company, and one who had reached out to Redfield months ago but was turned away. Not by me, by him. I'll be there in an hour, I said, already grabbing my coat. The drive through Lincoln felt longer than ever. My mind raced through possibilities. Claire? No. She had too much integrity. One of the junior designers at Hastings? Maybe. But something didn't sit right. This wasn't an accident. It felt orchestrated, specific. When I walked into the boardroom, the tension was suffocating. My father sat at the head of the table, eyes dark, jaw tight. Claire stood behind him, arms crossed. The assistant who had called me looked pale. They copied everything, my father said without preamble, down to the taglines, the rollout structure, even the color schemes. I glanced at the documents spread across the table. They weren't just similar. They were identical. Fonts, phrasing, even the website layout. They had stolen the entire narrative we built. This wasn't a random breach, I said. Someone handed this to them. My father stared at me. Who? I looked at Claire. Did anyone at Redfield share files externally? Even drafts? She shook her head immediately. No, we've been careful. Miles has our systems locked down tight. Then something struck me. I walked over to the laptop on the far side of the room and opened the folder labeled Archive, Internal Review. Every file had a timestamp. One of them had a duplicate, uploaded the same day, at the same time, with a different extension. I clicked it open. Embedded in the metadata was a username I hadn't seen in years. Ethan, my brother. I felt my stomach tighten. Ethan sent this, I said quietly. My father's head snapped up. What? This file was duplicated and downloaded through a cloud portal registered to Ethan's old university email address. He must have been using it as a backdoor. Why was he even given access? Claire looked like she'd just been punched. He asked me for a few design samples. Said he wanted to help pitch us to a new investor. I thought he was just trying to be useful. He sold us out, I whispered. To Beckman. The room exploded in noise. My father shouted for someone to get Ethan on the phone. Claire stood frozen. I sat down slowly, pressing my fingers to my temples. I couldn't process the betrayal yet. It wasn't just about the breach. It was about the pattern. The family I was born into always found a way to devalue me, and when they finally couldn't ignore me, they tried to hijack what I built. But this was different. This was war. An hour later, Ethan walked into the building like he owned it. No shame, no panic, just his usual charming grin. Really? I asked, my voice ice. You leaked proprietary strategy to a competitor. He shrugged. You were getting too big. I figured a little shakeup would remind everyone where the real loyalty lies. I stood up. You didn't just sabotage me. You sabotaged your own family's company. No, he said with a smirk. I saved it. Dad doesn't need a rebrand. He needs control. And you were turning this into your personal victory parade. My father didn't speak. He stared at his son, speechless. But I had heard enough. I turned to him and said, "This is your legacy. You raised a son who thought theft was a form of strategy." He still didn't speak. Not until Ethan left the room in a storm of entitlement and fake indignation. Then, finally, my father looked at me with something I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but grief. "You were right," he said softly. "I should have never let it get this far." "I didn't need you to protect me," I replied. "I just needed you not to work against me." He closed his eyes. "What now?" "Now?" I said. "Now we fight back." Redfield launched a counter-campaign within 48 hours. We leaked our own behind-the-scenes footage, testimonials from real farmers who had already been working with us, and side-by-side comparisons that highlighted the originality of our brand identity. We didn't attack Beckman directly. We let the facts speak for themselves. The media caught on quickly. Headlines shifted from "brand controversy" to "Hastings fights back with heart and history." Our version of the truth won. But the real climax wasn't public. It happened 2 weeks later, when Hastings Farmtech held its investor summit. I was scheduled to speak, but instead I asked to be introduced as the opening voice. Not as a family member, not as a brand strategist, but as a partner. The lights dimmed, the music swelled, and I walked onto that stage knowing every person in the room had once doubted I belonged there. "I wasn't invited to the last party," I said calmly, "because I didn't look the part. But here's the truth. Innovation doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears hand-me-downs. Sometimes it walks through the back door because the front one was locked. But eventually, it owns the building." The room erupted. My father didn't stand, but he clapped. Not politely, not softly. He clapped like a man who knew the tide had turned, and that he wasn't the one controlling it anymore. The applause eventually faded, but the echo of that moment lived far beyond the stage. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, not because I craved the spotlight, but because I knew what it meant to stand in it now. For so many years I had been waiting to be seen, to be heard, to be invited. But I no longer needed an invitation. I had written my own. After the summit, things moved quickly. Contracts were renewed. New clients emerged from cities I'd never worked in before. Redfield became a name people not only recognized but respected. And my name, Emery Hastings, was no longer the one that they whispered in confusion at family events. It was the name listed under keynote speakers, the name on the covers of industry articles, the name attached to strategies that made other companies billions. But with all of that came something unexpected: peace. And then, reflection. I didn't cut ties with my family completely. That was never the goal. I didn't want revenge that ended in ruin. I wanted truth. I wanted to show them who I was, not by burning the house down, but by renovating my own from the ground up. And truthfully, in their own ways, they began to change too. Claire and I started talking more, outside of business. She even invited me to her daughter's recital one Saturday afternoon. I almost said no out of habit. I didn't know how to accept gestures that weren't transactional, but I went. And as I sat in that folding chair, watching a 7-year-old twirl in a purple tutu, I felt something settle in my chest, a kind of quiet healing I didn't know I needed. My father was slower to change. Of course he was. Men like him don't just open up like books, but over time his emails became less formal, his phone calls more frequent. He started asking questions, not about strategy or metrics, but about me, about what I liked, what I wanted, what I was building next. He never apologized for the party, not directly. But one evening, a package arrived at my apartment with no note, no branding, just a box wrapped in dark green paper. Inside was the invitation I never received, the original, with my name printed in gold, addressed to Ms. Emery Hastings. I held it in my hands for a long time. It was late. The apartment was quiet. And in that silence, I understood. This was the closest he could come to saying, "I'm sorry." So I accepted it. Not because it made up for everything, but because it showed me he had finally seen me. As for Ethan, he vanished from the public eye for a while after the data breach. Beckman tried to protect him, but the industry has a long memory when it comes to betrayal. He resurfaced months later, working for a minor logistics firm in another state. We haven't spoken since that day in the office, and I don't think we ever will. Not because I hate him, but because I'm no longer interested in pulling people back into my life who never wanted me to succeed on my own terms. Redfield continued to grow. We hired new team members, expanded to international markets, and even opened an innovation lab for small-town entrepreneurs in Nebraska who had ideas but no voice. That was my favorite project. It reminded me of who I used to be, hungry, unseen, underestimated. And it reminded me of why I kept pushing forward, even when everything told me to stop. I started speaking at universities, not as a guest lecturer, but as someone who had lived through every single slide they put on the projector. I didn't talk about success. I talked about being invisible, about being told no, about making something out of silence. I wanted the students sitting in those cheap plastic chairs to know that worth isn't always loud, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the sharpest vision. One day, after a particularly long panel, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been older than 23. She was shaking, holding a small notebook in her hand. "You don't know me," she said, "but I've followed your story since the article in Midwest Innovators. I didn't think people like me could ever get there, but you did, and I just wanted to say thank you." I smiled. Not because I was proud, but because I recognized the look in her eyes. I had seen it in my own reflection years ago. "Don't try to get there," I told her gently. "Build there yourself." That night, I went home and opened my journal, the same one I had written in after being turned away from the party. I flipped to the page with the line I had written so long ago. "They dismissed me because I looked like nothing. I'll return when I look like power." And under it, I added a new line. And I stayed because I no longer needed them to see it. I already knew. My life didn't become perfect. That's not how this works. There were still difficult projects, still moments of doubt, still nights I questioned whether I had really made it, or if I was just spinning on a prettier wheel. But what had changed, truly changed, was my foundation. I no longer built to prove. I built because it was who I was. One morning, I found myself driving past the country club, the same one I had been turned away from all those years ago. There was an event happening again. Fancy cars valet, gold banners strung across the doors. I could have walked in this time. I could have bought the building if I wanted to. But I didn't stop. I kept driving, because the victory wasn't in being let in. It was in realizing I didn't need to be there anymore. I had already created something better, my own legacy. And maybe that's the most powerful kind of revenge. Not the kind where you crush those who doubted you, but the kind where you outgrow the space they tried to keep you in, where your presence becomes undeniable, where your voice is no longer something they ignore, but something they remember. Not because they finally accepted you, but because you finally accepted yourself. And that's how I became the boss. Not just of a company, but of my story. It's strange how, sometimes, the most transformative moments of your life don't feel grand when they're happening. They don't arrive with fireworks or drum rolls. They slip in quietly, like sunrise filtering through old curtains, warming the room before you even notice the light has changed. That's how it felt in the months after the summit, after the campaign, after the storm of validation and betrayal had passed. Life didn't slow down, but I did. I had finally reached a place where I could breathe without bracing for the next blow. I could sit in a room and not feel like I had to earn my seat with every breath I took. The studio thrived. We built something steady and sustainable, not a flash in the pan, not a quick success story. We created a company where people felt valued, where creativity wasn't squeezed into a mold, where hard work didn't mean burning yourself to ash. And it wasn't just about business anymore. It was about what kind of leader I was becoming, what kind of legacy I was willing to leave behind. Not one built on survival, but on strength. Claire and I grew closer in ways that felt earned. She came to me with questions, not instructions. She asked for advice, not just updates. Our conversations no longer had the weight of competition between every sentence. One afternoon, she brought her daughter by the office. "This is your Aunt Emery," she told her. "She's the smartest person I know." It was just a sentence, but it stayed with me, because I remembered a time when I would have given anything to hear something like that from anyone in my family. My father, too, softened, though in his own quiet, weathered way. We didn't talk every week, but when we did, it wasn't about the company. He asked me about my health, my travel, my ideas. He listened in ways he never had before. One Sunday, he invited me over for dinner. No formal event, no agenda. Just grilled salmon and steamed vegetables, and the soft hum of jazz playing from an old speaker in the kitchen. Halfway through the meal, he looked up from his plate and said, "You know, I always thought legacy meant structures and stock options, but I was wrong. It's about people, and I didn't realize how much of mine was missing until I saw what you'd built." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, because that in itself was the apology I never thought I'd get. I still had moments where the old ache crept in, where I remembered that girl outside the party, her hands cold, her heart burning, her pride bruised. But now when she showed up in my memory, I smiled at her. I wanted her to know she wasn't weak. She wasn't forgotten. She was just at the beginning of something extraordinary. 1 year after the relaunch of Hastings Farm Tech, we hosted a joint event, Redfield and Hastings together. Not a gala, not a party, just an open conference focused on innovation in agricultural branding. We invited small business owners, university students, farmers, designers, anyone who wanted to learn, grow, connect. It wasn't about showing off, it was about giving back. The closing panel was mine. I stepped onto that stage, this time, with no tension in my shoulders, no mask on my face, just truth. I used to think power meant being feared, I said. That in order to be respected, you had to be ruthless. But now I understand. Real power is quiet. It's built when no one is watching. It's choosing to rise without stepping on others. It's being told you don't belong, and showing up anyway. There was a standing ovation. But what mattered more was what came after. One of the final guests to approach me that day was an older woman in her 60s. Her hands were calloused, her posture upright despite years of hard work. She wore a faded denim jacket with a sunflower stitched onto the sleeve. "I'm not a designer," she said, "but I've been running a community farm for decades. I've seen people like you come and go. Most of them talk big and do little. But not you. You came back for more than just your seat. You made room for others. And that's something." I thanked her, my voice catching in my throat. That was all I'd ever wanted. Not fame, not applause, just to be useful. To be seen for what I brought to the table, and to make sure the table had enough chairs. In the months that followed, Redfield launched an initiative called The Foundry, a mentorship and funding program for young entrepreneurs in overlooked rural areas. We partnered with universities and nonprofits to help students build their ideas into reality. It became the soul of our company, and I poured myself into it with everything I had, because I remembered what it felt like to be underestimated. And I vowed to be the kind of leader I had once needed. I also found time, finally, for myself. I took weekends off. I traveled. I painted again, just for me. The canvases weren't for display or sale. They were messy and personal and full of colors I didn't know I still carried inside me. I met people who didn't know my last name, who didn't care about my history, who just saw me. And in their company, I healed a little more. Eventually, I bought a new place, not to prove anything, but because I could. It wasn't massive or flashy, but it had big windows and a garden out back. It felt like breath. It felt like home. Sometimes late at night, I would walk out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and stare up at the Nebraska sky, wide and endless and quiet. And I would think of that night I stood outside the country club, heartbroken and humiliated, and smile. Because that version of me, the one who was turned away, who walked home alone, who wrote one defiant sentence in a notebook, was the reason I became who I am. She was not weak. She was not discarded. She was forged. And I would honor her every day of my life. So here's the truth, the full truth. I was banned from my father's party for looking poor. Then I built something richer than they ever imagined. I was dismissed because I didn't wear the right clothes, speak the right way, walk with the right kind of polished confidence. Then I walked into the room as the boss. Not because they finally let me, but because I finally stopped waiting for permission. This is not just a story about revenge. It's a story about reclamation. And in the end, it's a story about rising, not to spite those who doubted you, but to remind yourself that you were never less than, not for a second, and never again. Have you ever been shut out by the very people who were supposed to believe in you the most? If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, share your thoughts in the comments. And if my story moved you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of rising from silence to strength. Someone you know might need to hear this today. Share it with them. Because sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest gift. If we use it to build something no one can take from us. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, you don't need permission to become who you're meant to be.